Slay the Princess is a game that is very near and dear to me, and what I've been meaning to discuss for a while now. For those watching this video who haven't played the game, first off, I'd highly recommend it because I think it's a masterpiece. But if you're like me and like to watch video essays on media you know nothing about, I'll provide a very brief overview of the game's narrative. If you've already played the game before, or if you want to skip the general summary of the game, then you can skip to this time code on screen. The general plot of Slay the Princess is to, well, slay the princess. This is what you're told at the start of your journey by a character named the narrator, who will inform you to head to the cabin where she is being imprisoned and slay her to prevent the end of the world. Your encounter with the princess can play out in a myriad of different ways, ranging from you following the narrator's advice and cold-heartedly slaying the princess, to you attempting to rescue the princess, or even to defying the narrator's words from the beginning and avoiding the cabin altogether. Regardless of your choice here though, nearly all of them will lead to your death, which then leads you into a Chapter 2. This Chapter 2 is dependent on your actions in the prior chapter, and although the narrator claims he's unable to remember what happened in the previous chapter, the princess remembers, and moreover, her entire form and even the cabin itself transforms. Additionally, you will gain a new voice in your head, when in the first chapter there was only the narrator and the voice of the hero. This new voice you gain is seemingly the remaining vestige of the you in the prior chapter, and so what voice you gain is also reflective of what you did in the prior chapter. The multitude of Chapter 2s within the game could even evolve into further Chapter 3s. For a practical example of what one of these Chapter 2s look like, if you attempt to slay the princess in the first chapter without hesitation, but decide after to check if she's really dead, the princess will return to life momentarily and take you down with a secret blade of her own. This leads to a Chapter 2 titled The Razor, where the cabin becomes a jagged, sharp disaster which is hardly recognizable from when you first saw it. In this chapter, you gain the voice of the cheated, who, as you may guess from his name, feels cheated after the princess killed us despite how you should have already won. The princess herself also changes, now presenting herself in the most suspicious manner she possibly could, and she is not very subtle about her intentions to not stab you to death.
And why would I stab you to death? I don't know you. You haven't given me a reason to stab you to death. It would be so silly of me to cut you open and look at your insides.
Okay, I could have sworn we didn't mention stabbing anyone to death.
The reason the princess can so drastically shift like this is due to the true nature of the princess. The princess is largely defined by what you believe about her, and this is why her form is constantly changing in the way it does. Using the razor as an example again, we can see how the razor becomes this way due to how the voice of the cheated believes she is conspiring to kill you again. And as I said earlier, the game has many chapters with many different princesses for you to find, and discovering these princesses becomes interwoven with the narrative, because at the end of every chapter, these weird hands will come to collect the princess at the end. This leads you to an entity you later learn is named the Shifting Mound, who requests that you collect more of these princesses, or vessels as the game calls them, and give the Shifting Mound more perspective so that she could fully awaken. Now then, before I delve into this game to begin this analysis, I have to establish at just what angle I'm analyzing this game from. Slay the Princess has been dissected many times before me, and in particular, an important analysis on this game that this video is founded upon is an analysis by Katie and Catburger about the game. This analysis examines the game through how the many Chapter 2s of the game are implied to be matched in pairs due to this sequence in a route named The Stranger, where these arms representing each Chapter 2 of the game are visually paired together. This analysis explores Slay the Princess's beliefs on love and relationships based on the parallels in these pair of chapters. Now this video is really excellent, and although it's not completely required watching material to understand my own analysis, I highly recommend it as I will build on the general foundation this analysis established. The main reason why I'm here trying to expand on a separate analysis is because Katie's analysis released prior to the Pristine Cut, which was a major update to Slay the Princess, adding and expanding onto many of the game's roots. And moreover, this analysis also strictly only covered the Chapter 2s in Slay the Princess. And as I said prior, Slay the Princess also has a multitude of Chapter 3s in it, and these Chapter 3s present some of the game's most interesting content in my opinion. And it's those Chapter 3s that I hope to dissect in this video. Something I must note here before proceeding is that Slay the Princess has a general structure for the Chapter 2s and Chapter 3s throughout the game. As an example, the sequence in the Stranger route has the narrator talking about rivalry and submission, which seems to be referring to a pair of Chapter 2s titled The Adversary and The Tower respectively. All of the Chapter 3s of the game stem from a previous Chapter 2, with each Chapter 2 having both a Chapter 3 unique to the Chapter 2 it came from, and another accessible Chapter 3 that is shared with that Chapter 2's opposite. Laying it out like this is probably quite confusing though, so for an example of this, using the Tower and Adversary routes here, the Tower has a unique Chapter 3 titled the Apotheosis, while the Adversary has a unique Chapter 3 titled the Eye of the Needle. But both the Tower and Adversary also allow access to a Chapter 3 titled the Fury. This video aims to analyze just the Chapter 3s that are unique to an individual Chapter 2, and examine how it contrasts with that Chapter 3's paralleling chapter. So in this case, we will just be analyzing Chapter 3s like the Apotheosis and Eye of the Needle, and we won't be discussing any Chapter 3s that are shared between two Chapter 2s like the Fury. Although if this video does well, I would definitely be interested in taking a look at these shared chapters. Prior to the Pristine Cut's release, we didn't have access to all of the unique Chapter 3s, but now that we do, I hope to dissect how I believe these routes are juxtaposed against each other to further the complexities of Slay the Princess's ideas and themes regarding love. It is important to note though that unlike Katie's analysis, there is a less concrete basis to analyze these routes as pairs, since unlike how the Chapter 2s are clearly implied to parallel each other, there is no moment in the game as far as I know of which compares Chapter 3s. And while I think following this logic for all of the Chapter 3s has led to some very fascinating conclusions, I also can't deny that the foundation of this analysis is admittedly somewhat shaky, so please take any conclusions I reach in this video with a grain of salt. With all of the preamble out of the way, let's finally begin discussing what these chapters comment on regarding love and relationships, starting with
Consumption and betrayal.
Consumption and betrayal refers to the Beast and the Witch Chapter 2s respectively, and their corresponding unique Chapter 3s are the Den and the Thorn. First off, let's start by tackling the Den. The Den, as I just stated, branches from the Beast, and can be accessed from dying to the Beast in a way which avoids the Beast consuming you whole during your confrontation with it. The Den itself is largely an evolution of the Beast, as the Den has shifted into being an even more animalistic version of the princess, with the Den no longer even having the capacity to directly speak like the Beast could. The interior of the cabin, now not even remotely resembling a cabin, is a small open area buried beneath the earth enveloped in total darkness. The environment working to the predator's advantage as it allows for her to lunge at you from the shadows. This route itself has a strong thematic focus on our survival instincts. That's a fact made apparent through how the Den is a literal animal trying to consume you, and this theme is also informed by the endings of this route. One of the endings for the Den here involves fighting the Den, and deciding to embrace instinct as the voice of the hunted encourages. Embracing your instincts in the struggle will lead to the two of you being able to technically live forever as you feast and regenerate on each other's flesh. As the narrator describes, you begin to lose yourself more and more the further you consume. Once the shifting mound begins to collect the Den in this ending, her eyes will even question and regret what the two of you have done. In fact, I believe that this glimmer of regret the Den experiences in this ending is pivotal to what this route is trying to explore thematically, because this pervading feeling of regret is present in many of the endings to this chapter. The Den allows you to either have the voice of the stubborn or the voice of the skeptic accompany you as the unique Chapter 3 voice. And with both of these voices' distinct strategies, the Den will still end up showing some form of regret in most of the endings. If you choose to fight the Den with the stubborn, whether you embrace your instincts or take a strike at her heart, she will lament what the two of you have done. And in the endings with the voice of the skeptic, where he encourages you to lure the beast through the tunnel you entered through, the Den will regret what the situation has come to when the two of you get stuck in the tunnel. Even if you choose to approach the Den while both of you are stuck in the tunnel and leave yourself open for attack, the Den will show what the narrator calls a sorrowful confusion when she finally attempts to devour you. The voice of the hunted describes the Den most aptly when talking about her.
Yes, she's a victim of her own nature, just like we are.
When reading this chapter in the broader context of a love story, and as an expansion on the Chapter 2 Beast, the Den presents the natural extreme of what a relationship where one party listens only to their animalistic instincts would lead to. the beast established this theme of considering only your natural instincts, because she is a predator whose dialogue shows how she desires to devour you solely because of those instincts. Even when prompted to introspect more on her reasons, she actively refused because she doesn't consider anything more than what her instincts desire. The den furthers this idea of listening only to instinct, but also demonstrates how a prolonged relationship extremely reliant only on instincts will inevitably lead to you hurting your partner if we consider everyone a threat to our survival. And as the den shows, the mindless instincts eventually falter in the wake of the terrible mistakes those impulses led to, which just results in a deep feeling of regret. The best resolution you can reach in the den is the ending in which the two of you, trapped inside the tunnel, decide to work together to survive from the collapsing tunnel and the earth itself. And despite how I've discussed the negative aspects of relying on survival instincts alone, this ending demonstrates how the inherent survival instincts we have aren't necessarily bad. The foundation for us to engage in any kind of relationship is our continued survival, and the den proves that those instincts can be channeled into something more collaborative with how we dig out of the crumbling earth together. Our instincts to survive only clash against our relationships when we completely forsake ourselves and our partners to the most animalistic and raw impulses we have. And overall, I believe that the healthiest way to interpret this chapter in a love story is as a cautionary tale for how unsustainable a relationship engaged solely with instincts is. The opposite chapter 2 to the den is the witch, which has the Thorn as its unique chapter 3. The Thorn is an absolutely beloved root by the community, and while its themes are much more apparent in comparison to other chapters, I still hope to provide as much unique insight into it as I can. Although I am definitely getting a bit ahead of myself, because this route especially requires a lot of context to understand. The true beginning of this route is in the first chapter, where you must enter the basement without the pristine blade, but then decide to betray the princess by either retrieving the blade upstairs or by stabbing her in the back once it magically enters the basement. The princess will then kill you, and in the following chapter, she will become the witch. Despite how the witch's expression is constantly that stupid colon-free emoji, it's clear that she holds a lot of bitter resentment for what you did to her in the prior loop. The only way you can reach the Thorn route is by taking the pristine blade with you, and deciding to give her the blade as a sign of trust. The witch will become confused on why you gave her the blade, because she cannot envision you attempting to earnestly try to make amends and free her. This results in the witch presuming that you giving her the blade must be a part of some malicious scheme that you have planned, and she unpromptly stabs us with the blade. Once you begin to die out from the witch's stab, she immediately starts to become confused and regretful over slaying us. And after this, the Thorn chapter begins. Upon first glance, when comparing the Thorn and Den, these two routes seem to have the chapter 3 princesses evolve in starkly different ways. The Den initially is a natural follow-up to the beast, while the Thorn is almost entirely opposite to the witch in her behavior. The witch was a princess constantly scheming and plotting to try and make you suffer, as she is hell-bent on revenge, while the Thorn is completely worn down from the events of the last loops. The Thorn and Wild's association with nature even contrasts, because while the witch is able to use the wilds to crush both you and her to death on command, the Thorn has thistles rooted in her skin that completely constrain her. When you finally encounter the Thorn, you're given the chance to talk with her. She's stuck at a cross of wanting to trust you, but also struggling to do so due to the hurt you've both caused to each other. And because you gave her the blade in the last chapter, the Thorn retains that blade, and she desperately holds onto it to prevent you from grasping it. If you attempt to turn around and walk away from the situation, the thorns around the cabin prevent you from leaving, and the princess begins to relish in her spite as she attempts to swallow the blade whole to remove it entirely from the picture. The only way to get a good outcome here is to talk to her, and establish to her that you truly do want to break free of the cycle of violence and abuse plaguing your relationship. With enough persistence, the Thorn will eventually relinquish her blade, and once she does, you have the option to cut the thorny vines entrapping the Thorn within this cabin. And in the only time in the game ever, you even have the option to kiss her, which honestly may be one of the funniest scenes in the game just from how the voices in your head discuss it.
Enthusiastically, you kiss. It's done. Are you happy now?
Come on now, this is the big moment! You can do better than that.
Ugh, fine. You and the princess lock eyes and stare deep into each other's souls with all the roaring emotion that comes from letting what once was hatred turn into pure, unbridled passion. Are you making fun of us? Please. I think he actually likes romance.
It doesn't matter either way because this is good stuff.
As the Thorn's main conflict in this chapter makes apparent, this chapter's themes center around trust, particularly how difficult trusting a partner can be in the wake of a relationship that has become abusive. The hurt that the both of you have inflicted onto each other is undeniable. In the first chapter, you betrayed the princess by going back on your word and attempting to backstab her. And in the second chapter, the witch stabbed you believing you had ulterior motives. The emphasis of the bad blood between you is especially punctuated by the red poppies which litter the interior of the cabin, because poppies symbolize remembrance of war, since they are often worn as a tribute to soldiers who have fallen in war. The thorns themselves that adorn both the princess and the entire cabin are also used excellently as a thematic device to represent this prolonged cycle of hurt and violence the two of you have been in. If you perpetuate the cycle by choosing to abandon her, the thorns that initially only captured the princess will also begin to entangle you. The only way that the thorns filling the cabin can be cut through is through the pristine blade, and that blade can only be regained through earnest trust between you and the princess. Now, to be honest, when I initially began scripting this video, I wasn't sure about how exactly the den and Thorn were meant to parallel each other, because at first glance, these roots seem to have nothing correlating to each other. After contemplating on it more though, I believe that these chapters are connected thematically from what the Den and Thorn's respective chapter 2s established. As Katie's analysis discussed about the beast and the witch, these chapters largely focused on how survival and love can interact with each other. With the beast, the narrative displayed survival through our raw instincts, and the witch through our cunning wit. The Den and Thorn to me show that these relationships that are founded upon survival from either the perspective of instinct or wit will inevitably break down over the course of a long-term relationship. With the Den, embracing solely animalistic instincts results in a relationship filled with laments and regrets over the often irreparable damage those impulses cause. On the other hand, with the Thorn, attempting to remain eternally suspicious and hell-bent on your revenge can cause you to hurt another person who may have genuinely wanted to move past the bad blood the two of you have started. At some point, the endless suspicion you've employed will crumble as you exhaust of doubting. Although each of these chapters begins with extremely toxic and abusive relationships, Slay the Princess also demonstrates how it believes we can overcome these single-minded desires to truly begin recovering from these abusive relationships.
Skepticism and blind devotion.
Skepticism and blind devotion refer to the chapter 2's The Prisoner and the Damsel respectively, and the chapter 3's unique to these chapter 2's are The Caged and Happily Ever After. Since we're discussing these pairs in the order they are described in, we'll first discuss The Caged. The Caged is a route accessible from the prisoner, and specifically if you decide to give the prisoner the blade as she requests. The prisoner will cut off her own head, and if you decide not to carry the head with you, you'll be locked and trapped within the cabin for all eternity. The narrator tries to provide you with the good ending, but the voice of the skeptic won't allow it, and insists that you slay yourself to find the ever-elusive truth of the situation. Even just upon starting this chapter, you're met with some of the game's most striking imagery yet. The area that used to be a forest is now a desolate area of chains binding what would have been the trees. And even the cabin itself is now located on a separate island that is completely enveloped in chains. And as you may have noticed from the visuals, chains themselves are the recurring visual motif of this chapter. This visual motif is made even more apparent when we see the princess herself, who is a head trapped in a cage being dragged along by her separated body, which itself is seemingly moved around by chains. The prominent theme of this chapter, which the visual motif hints at, is lack of freedom. The princess's dialogue solidifies this theme of a lack of autonomy, with how she describes the events that have transpired so far as an endless cycle of violence the two of you have been trapped in. In the princess's own words, she describes how
everything we witness is just another shade of the same endless cycle. I wake up in chains. You come to me, knife in hand. You give me your implement. I cut myself free.
Despite how the cage posits on how this is an inevitable and endless cycle you're both imprisoned in, many things about the chapter itself show how this cycle is partially imposed on herself. The self-imposed nature of the princess's belief is ultimately exposed if you can break from the princess's expectations by discarding the pristine blade before meeting her. This causes the princess to realize that her actions do have genuine consequence and meaning, and she's able to free the both of you from this once she realizes that. From how the cage discusses how freeing it is for her to drop the pretenses of either of your choices mattering, we could gather that the cage essentially strongly believes in a fatalism-like philosophy. As a quick Google search tells us, fatalism is a philosophy which holds the belief that all events are predetermined and therefore inevitable. While fatalism in a situation like the cage could often lead to the princess feeling a strong sense of nihilism and despair from the meaningless nature of your choices, the cage interprets it differently. Because to the caged, it's easier to acknowledge the loop the two of you are stuck in as a fixed result you are inherently predisposed to. With this thinking, the princess can remove the burden of choice from the both of you and disassociate from those choices, because in her mind, they were never making any real choices to begin with. Now I must make a quick clarification before proceeding with the rest of the video, because I don't want to be insensitive regarding philosophies here. Despite how it may seem from the way I'm describing fatalism, I don't believe that the philosophy itself is inherently toxic or negative. I'd actually say that it's important to recognize that some events and some outcomes are simply out of your hand, and be able to proceed with that in a healthy way. However, the cage's extreme belief in this predeterminism is something Slay the Princess itself depicts as being very unhealthy for her. Especially since, within the context of the game's own world, this construct that you and the princess are in quite literally functions based on your perception of the princess and the situation. When examining this from the angle of a love story, I believe this chapter is commenting on how distant we can grow from relationships. Before even reaching the cage, you have to deal with the prisoner in chapter 2. And the prisoner was already a princess overruled by logic, and kept her distance from us. To the prisoner, either the outcome where the two of you sit by idly until the cabin erodes to the point you can escape, or the outcome where she takes the blade from us and takes her life into her own hands is preferable to her. The prisoner believes the smartest thing to do is to remain cautious and keep her guard up from you. The prisoner's caution itself becomes the primary factor that leads to the cage chapter at all, since her plan is to ultimately cut off her own head, and have us take her separated head outside of the cabin. Her plan ultimately fails because she executes it without communicating it to you at all, which would leave you with no reason to collect her head as she'd hoped you to do. When that plan of the prisoner's to have her head taken outside failed, the distancing she applied to you then expanded to apply to the entire situation the two of you were placed in. Overall, the cage shows us how we can choose to distance and disassociate ourselves from our loved ones and the circumstances behind our relationships. The allure of this prospect is presented with how the cage mindset allows her to remove the burden of choice from the two of you. By doing this, you can avoid the pain of the often difficult circumstances surrounding our relationships. Slay the Princess recognizes though that by believing this, we often limit our own perceived amount of choices, and ultimately, we often have much more autonomy within the harsh circumstances than we may recognize ourselves. It's only through the difficult decision to be proactive within our relationships that we can begin to even attempt trying to break free from the stagnant loops of misery that come with our relationships that keep us chained and caged. While the prisoner's chapter 3 is titled The Cage, the prisoner's counterpart, the damsel, has a unique chapter 3 titled Happily Ever After. However, the game itself doesn't even classify this chapter as a chapter 3, but rather as an epilogue. Now this chapter is my personal favorite of any rune in this game, and I'm very excited to get into it. But let's start by covering it from the beginning. Happily Ever After is a chapter you can reach in the damsel by suggesting that the two of you just stay in the cabin forever. After you propose this idea, the damsel will ultimately agree with what you want, although it's clear from looking at the princess's reaction that this prospect makes her somewhat uncomfortable. The voice of the spin, who accompanies you on the damsel chapter, will notice the princess's reluctance, and begins to have what I can only describe as a high-level crash out over her hesitant acceptance.
No,
It has to be him. It has to be this place. If we just made these walls more fitting for a princess, if we just say the right things.
Because the voice of the Smitten perceives the princess as a person, or more accurately, as a thing who should enthusiastically agree to everything you do, he immediately begins to panic over superficial reasons for the princess's discomfort. Ultimately, the Smitten resolves to show the princess the contents of your heart by literally ripping it out. And as a natural result, this action kills you, and leads you into the happily ever after route. In this route, the princess will welcome you to sit down at this dining table, which you are forcibly made to sit in. Your forcible seating at this table is seemingly the work of this shadowy figure behind the princess, who appears to be binding her into place as well. And we later discover that this shadow is actually the voice of the Smitten, who's separated from you now. The princess tells you that she wants you and her to start being happy, and that you've now both received everything you're supposed to have ever wanted. It's supposed to be your happy ever after. She offered you many activities for the two of you to partake in and enjoy, and although each activity is initially very delightful and entertaining, they all quickly lose their novelty. For example, the princess first offers that you should eat dinner together, and although it's a gourmet meal at first, it eventually becomes a poor meal that loses any of its luster. The princess then offers a game for the two of you to enjoy, and it starts as an elegant game that is fun for the both of you. But then it grows boring, and to make up for that boredom, the princess just rules to spice up the game. It ultimately grows boring again, becoming as tiring as the food was. The narrator will even describe how the game eventually just becomes endings of victory or loss, and those endings cease to mean anything significant as you just roll over into the next game. As the pervading monotony and dullness of these activities starts settling in, the princess becomes more and more panicked in convincing both herself and the Smitten that she's happy here, but this pretense falters the further you progress into the chapter. This is visually signified through the torches in the room extinguishing every time the princess begins to admit that these distractions are becoming boring. And at the end of the chapter, once the final torch goes out, the princess finally confesses that she's never been happy here. It's this arc of the princess which makes the ending of this chapter so satisfying, where the two of you dance together under the stars. You're no longer seated so far apart from each other while keeping up the illusion of a loving relationship. Now, you can put the weight of anyone else's expectations that could find you before or behind, and be together with each other in whatever way you both want, expressing all of your earnest feelings to each other without hiding it behind the guise of being in a seemingly happy and stable relationship. I would also be remiss not to mention the insane amount of marriage coding between you and the princess in this route. The princess's first line of this chapter is quite literally,
You're home. Dinner's ready.
and the route itself was apparently codenamed the divorce route during development.
I want to sit in a brightly lit, spacious room where we can see our beautiful, queenly wife.
This marriage coding is pivotal to understanding what this route is doing thematically, because despite the game's abstract scenario, it depicts a marriage with extremely realistic flaws. A marriage where one party has been preconditioned into what a happy marriage looks like, and tries to uphold these established values about love that ultimately results in a falling out of love. Genuine flaws in a marriage like this are often glossed over because of how we believe that this relationship should already be perfectly stable, and because of this, we often don't know how to pick up the pieces when these faults come to light. Happily Ever After is a heartbreakingly accurate showing of just how many marriages can end up. But at the same time, Slay the Princess recognizes that unless we acknowledge the issues in our relationship, we can trap ourselves in relationships that we have to convince ourselves are perfect for us, that we have to convince ourselves to care for, even when in reality, we don't. Upon first blush, it would seem like the cage and Happily Ever After would have nothing to do with each other. I mean, after all, one of them is about an endless cycle of violence, while the other is about a crumbling marriage. However, I believe both of these chapters share an integral thematic element which strongly contrasts in its depiction in these chapters, and that theme is stagnation. The cage focuses on stagnation in a loveless relationship, and because of this, the cage is able to immediately recognize the stagnation within her relationship with you, and chooses to prematurely dissociate herself from the entire situation to alleviate herself from the painful circumstances. And juxtaposing that is Happily Ever After, which showcases stagnation within a more loving relationship, where the princess spends the entire chapter denying the issues of this prolonged relationship. The princess only tries to be happy with you for activities like feasting and playing card games, which ultimately only amount to band-aid solutions that fail to address the underlying issues of this stagnant marriage. These themes of stagnation are communicated expertly in both routes, through both the princess's interactions and also of how these chapters play with the general structure of the game's chapters. In the other chapters, you always begin in some form of woods, even if the environment itself was often highly distorted. In the Happily Ever After route, you start inside the cabin, which appears to be more like a fancy cathedral than a cabin. And while on every other route you have to descend the stairs leading to the basement, you have to ascend these stairs in the Happily Ever After route to proceed. And even the narrator's typically unwavering belief that the princess must be slain is challenged and destroyed with the events of this chapter. The narrator will even directly comment on how distinct this chapter is from what he was expecting, saying that,
I have to say, whatever you did in your previous lives, I deeply dislike how much it's thrown me off my rhythm.
the subversive nature of the Happily Ever After route contrasts superbly well with The Caged, because in contrast to the Happily Ever After route, which breaks from the formula, The Cage tends to automate on the established and expected events. The Cage doesn't require you to pick up the Pristine Blade, for example, because that's something you automatically start with. And the Cage doesn't need you to descend the basement either, because that automatically happens once you enter the cabin itself. Events like these become automated and decided for you, like the princess recognizes that all the events were foregone conclusions anyways. The Happily Ever After and The Cage's paralleling use of the game's structure reflects each of the chapters' focus on stagnation. Happily Ever After presents a subversive structure from the other chapters. Although it's unique initially, it's something that the player will grow accustomed to and eventually find tiring, much like the distractions the princess offers in this very chapter. The Cage, on the other hand, completely follows and even automates on the expected structure, because the Cage fully believes that this loop is endless and unbreakable. Overall, I believe these chapters are showing us long-term relationships, and the many ways we will try to cope with handling the underlying flaws that appear in them over time. In particular, these chapters present two unhealthy and diametrically opposed ways of how we will address or fail to address these fundamental faults in relationships. On one hand, we can choose to recognize these faults, but decide not to solve them and distance yourself from them to keep yourself from getting hurt. And on the other end, we may decide to evade and deny these core relationship issues and immerse ourselves too much into the fantasy of a healthy relationship. Both of these extremes are unhealthy ways of coping over a failing relationship. And the only way either chapter gets a happy resolution is through the princess accepting her true beliefs about her circumstances and being earnest about them.
Rivalry and submission.
Our next pair of chapters is described as Rivalry and Submission, which reference the adversary in the tower. The unique chapter frees for these routes are the Eye of the Needle and the Apotheosis respectively. Starting with the Eye of the Needle, you reach this chapter from the adversary as said prior, and the adversary lusts for a rematch against you after you both fought to the death in the first chapter. To access the Eye of the Needle, you have to try to fight the adversary like she requests, but approach the battle in a more tactical way, and not in the self-indulgent and raw approach like she demands out of you. This exchange will lead to the princess growing disappointed in you, and pummeling you until you die. When the Eye of the Needle chapter begins properly, the most common voice to be accompanied with you here is the voice of the hunted. He will suggest that you should still rely on your tactics and survivalist nature, and let them give you the edge by luring the princess out into the open, outside of the cabin. The princess herself is just as hungry for a good fight as she was before, and she's tired of waiting for you to prove it, believing that your tactics and tricks are nothing more than just aimless shenanigans. You could challenge the princess's notions about your fighting though, because the open space outside the cabin lets your agility shine over her brute strength, finally providing her with the fight that she was always craving. On its face, this chapter's most evident theme would be about our desires for growth and self-improvement. This is something that the shifting Mound herself will comment on during your final confrontation with her, saying that you were able to show the Eye of the Needle just how much further she had to develop. For most of the chapter, she demands for you to give her a good fight, and had undermined your approach to battling her until you finally used those tactics to defeat her. In tandem with this theme of growth though, I have to establish something crucial about both this chapter and the adversary. A core motif surrounding these chapters is, well, all the fighting. The adversary's craving for a satisfying fight is what largely defines her character. And while this is by no means a unique interpretation, I believe that from the context of a love story, all of this fighting is meant to symbolically represent sex. The adversary in Eye of the Needle depict all of this fighting, and the desire for it, as extremely barbaric and downright degenerate, which aligns with this interpretation. And there's also just this line from the adversary that's pretty blatant about it too.
Oh, I remember you all right. Best 3 minutes of my life. So, why don't we do it again?
Moreover, the dynamic between you and the princess here also supports this. If you ask anything regarding the grander mysteries of the world, like why the two of you are looping or what your purposes are, she will be insistent that these things don't matter. This becomes even more pronounced in certain endings of the adversary, like if you refuse to fight her, she will become increasingly mad and confused about you trying to make her think. The only reason she even entertains conversations with you from the beginning is to ensure that you're fully locked in mentally to battle against her. When reframing the Eye of the Needle and the adversary like this, we can see how this relationship is predominantly defined by pleasure seeking. Our relationship is entirely reliant on sex, or as the game more tastefully presents it as, fighting. And because it's reliant on that, it's a relationship that can quickly crumble once a partner isn't meeting those high expectations. The Eye of the Needle wants this relationship of unfettered fighting to be revitalized, and as some of her dialogue tells us, it's something she's been obsessing over. Because her expectations of what constitutes a good fight are, she's naturally become disappointed when we attempt to fight her in any way that doesn't fit her extremely rigid demands. It's only when we create an opening to fight her in a field which gives us an advantage that she's able to realize on some level just how much more there was for her to explore. Especially since the cabin is intrinsically tied to the princess and the shifting mound, her leaving the cabin itself becomes somewhat symbolic for her stepping into a new world for the first time, and finally facing new experiences and challenges. On the other end of Eye of the Needle is the Apotheosis, which follows from the chapter 2, The Tower, where the princess is depicted as a divine goddess who can literally control your actions. The Tower's divine control over us is mainly caused by the new voice in chapter 2, the voice of the broken, who believes that the princess is infinitely above him, and wants to prostrate himself to what he believes is a higher power. You can reach the Apotheosis route from the tower by bringing the pristine blade down into the basement, and doing this will cause her to demand you slay yourself. If you followed any of the tower's demands before this point, you are forced to slay yourself and advance into the Apotheosis. When you begin the Apotheosis chapter, the princess will immediately ascend from the cabin as an actual god, bringing chunks of dirt and debris from the world itself like an imposing black hole. From this point, this chapter can play out in a variety of ways. If you decide to try and slay her with just a pristine blade, you can end up hurling it at one of her eyes, and ultimately defile her. Choosing to submit to the Apotheosis as she requests of you will lead to her attempting to break through the very construct the two of you are trapped in. But since your body is connected to the boundaries of the construct, the princess tearing through it hurts you and the voices in your head immensely. If you bite back against the pain, you can use the construct itself to completely restrain her. Alternatively, if you endure the pain, you will see a peek into the outside world before the shifting mound will come to collect the Apotheosis. The Apotheosis will recognize that she has not shown you much grace until now, and attempt to set you free in her final moments by throwing you towards the opening to the construct she made. You can also reach this branch if you have the voice of the paranoid with you in this chapter, who is able to largely deduce how the princess and the world itself change depending on what your beliefs are about it. He's even able to convince the broken to stand up for himself after having an unwavering belief in the princess till this point. Although this outcome ultimately results in something pretty similar to if you just submitted to her from the start of the chapter. Trying to examine a chapter with as many branching possibilities like this seemed really daunting at first. But the many resolutions to these slew of endings have a recurring idea with them that is illuminating on what this chapter is focusing on. In nearly all of the endings, the Apotheosis begins to recognize on some level that despite how she believes she was supremely above you, you are more equal than she thought. In the endings where you destroy her, she often begins to recognize the pain you've both inflicted onto each other. And in the ending where you submit to her, she even recognizes that she failed to show you the same grace you've shown her. Her firm superiority that she established in the tower, where she merely considered you a pet or a priest, begins to unravel. After all, it is through her divine ascension to break through the construct that we begin to tap into our own godhood and recognize our own autonomy. And despite the princess being so divine, she is ultimately no match for the shifting Mound, who is an actual god. Examining this chapter thematically, I believe it's continuing the discussion that the tower started on power imbalances in a relationship. And the Apotheosis shows just how unhealthy relationships where one partner remains completely supreme over the other actually are. In the worst endings for the princess, we obliterate and defile her to take her down a peg, with even the voice of the broken starting to try and take back his own agency in certain paths. And even in the best ending for the Apotheosis, we are forced to endure pain and suffering for her ascension, which she herself barely even acknowledges until the very end. Now admittedly, I'm not as invested in these sets of roots as I am with the others, but regardless, they both have a lot of interesting parallels with one another. For example, both routes feature the princess being free of the cabin as a pivotal event to the story of these chapters, especially since the princess is able to be outside the cabin for a very prolonged amount of time in both chapters compared to how it typically is the climax of any given route. The circumstances behind the princess's exit of the cabin entirely contrast from each route though. The Eye of the Needle has the princess being free of the cabin featured as her stepping foot into a new world, and it's a major part of the Voice of the Hunted's plan. The Apotheosis, by contrast, is free of the cabin right from the get-go, and is treated more as a footnote by the Apotheosis, since she believes this was destined to happen. This parallel can even go further too, considering how the Apotheosis will immediately try ascending to break free of the true prison, the construct, whereas the Eye of the Needle's world is effectively expanded by just stepping foot outside the cabin. Their general behaviors also juxtapose, because while the Eye of the Needle is portrayed as unabashed in her lust for barbaric fighting, which is even more unfiltered if we read it as analogous to sex, the Apotheosis has the personality of a controlled and divine goddess. These two princesses can actually be pretty easily mapped to Sigmund Freud's structural model of the psyche, known as the id, ego, and superego. Now, Freud himself was quite the interesting specimen, but we don't have the time to unpack all of that here. What's relevant to this analysis is Freud's psychoanalytical model, which, to explain very briefly, essentially posits that within us is the id, ego, and superego. The id is the part of us which is motivated by instinct, often engaging in pleasure-seeking behavior which provides immediate gratification. The superego is the part of us striving for ideal behavior, associated with our moral conscience, which is defined by parental and societal expectations. The ego then is what binds these two together, effectively serving as the rational mediator between these extremes, although the ego component of this model isn't very pertinent to what I want to say. The Eye of the Needle can be mapped to the id, as she is largely defined by her indulgent behavior in wanting a barbaric fight. She also demonstrates her desire for instant gratification for how impatient she becomes in search of an exciting fight. The Apotheosis would be the superego by contrast, as she believes that she, and every action she takes, to be ideal and divine. The association between these roots and the id and the superego grows even stronger when we consider the actual designs of the princess. The Eye of the Needle's design is that of a devil, while the Apotheosis is depicted as a goddess. The id and superego are often portrayed with imagery of devils and angels respectively. And while I'm not entirely sure how deliberate this may have been on the game's part, I do find it to be an interesting connection which enhances what I've said thus far. Overall, I believe these roots together comment on how our expectations for both ourselves and for our partners often negatively affect relationships. The Eye of the Needle has little expectations for herself aside from satisfying her own indulgences and pleasures in whatever way she wants. Because of this, she ends up forcing you to meet her own extremely strict and narrow expectations in order to satisfy her, even if it's those very expectations that restrict our ability to provide her with what she desires. The Apotheosis is the opposite to the Eye of the Needle, because the Apotheosis has very meager expectations for us, but believes herself to be destined to end everything as a divine goddess. Her inability to acknowledge you as an equal partner often leads to her severely mistreating you, which she only begins to recognize near the endings of this chapter. With these chapters, Slay the Princess demonstrates how both extremes of too little and too much expectation for both yourself and your partner can lead to extremely unhealthy relationship dynamics. Ultimately, healthy relationships are dependent on balanced expectations and power dynamics, and I believe Slay the Princess encourages this by showing how terribly a relationship that lacks this can be.
Terror and longing.
And finally, we arrive at our final pair of chapter 3s, Terror and Longing, which correlate to the moment of clarity and the princess and the dragon. These chapters branch from the nightmare and the specter respectively. The chapter I'd like to cover first is the moment of clarity, and compared to the other chapters, it's quite interesting. To access the moment of clarity route, you must decide to remain with your nightmare. The nightmare will then take off her mask and envelop you in darkness. What follows this is one of the game's trippiest sequences, where the narrator will begin to ostensibly describe an endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth for a tortured soul. The narrator eventually can't take describing this tragic scene, and once the scene is over, the princess tells you that you'll see her soon enough, and that you'll know what to do. After all of this, the chapter will finally commence, although just saying chapter is a bit misleading, because the moment of clarity is shown to occur after an innumerable amount of chapters. Unlike pretty much every other chapter in the game, the moment of clarity is extremely linear in regards to the choices that you can make. The linearity here is the primary focus of the story of this chapter, and most of the other narrative elements here reinforce that fact. In this chapter, your schizophrenia has reached its limits, for now you have gained all of the voices that you can in the game. All of these voices have had to endure all of the prior chapters that you didn't get the opportunity to play, and they've all effectively given up after trying to win against her so many times. The cabin itself still holds the pristine blade, but it's followed deep into the earth once you arrive. The princess emerges from the hole that the pristine blade fell into, and she informs you that your will has been completely dissolved from the repeated attempts your body tried to stop her. She requests that you finally free her, and since your free will has been completely destroyed, you have no option to object to her demands. Once the princess is inevitably released, she will briefly be able to relish in her freedom before being taken away by the shifting mound. I think the most common interpretation of this route would be its focus of inevitability, as the main events of this chapter are the voice's repeated failure to stop the princess, along with the princess herself having completely destroyed your free will. However, looking at this route within the context that this is a part of the game's love story becomes fascinating. Before this chapter, the princess was the nightmare, who was an absolute agent of fear and terror, meeting our expectations of her as something nightmarish when we decided to lock her away in the first chapter. She engages with you in a gleeful way, and her motivations in chapter 2 are to quite literally just be free so she could terrorize more people. Just from the character she's shown to have, there should be nothing about the nightmare, or the moment of clarity for that matter, that is remotely connected to love. However, what the nightmare and moment of clarity show is about love, and I think this becomes more apparent when examining this chapter from the nightmare's perspective. The shifting mount's description of the nightmare is very illuminating when seeing this from the nightmare's perspective, where the nightmare is described as,
This one is filled with sadness. A doll, abandoned to the company of her darkest impulses. She desires only companionship, but the only thing she knows is how to hurt. She will make for a tender heart.
There's even a few details surrounding the moment of clarity which align with this, such as how there's a single tear which drops before she envelops you in darkness, or how the touch of her hand is described as being surprisingly tender. With this established about the moment of clarity, I believe this chapter examines love from the angle of empathy and intimacy. Both the nightmare and the moment of clarity ultimately only desire intimacy, but because her very existence is dreadful and repulsive to us, she has to remove our own free will from the equation in order to gain this intimacy. And while she finally gets to be free, and while we do take her hand, it's undeniable that this was an outcome that we had no choice in. What the moment of clarity princess reaches in this moment can never be real intimacy, because true intimacy requires the understanding and consent of both partners in a relationship. It's sort of akin to how the voice of the spin treats the damsel. only instead of flattening the princess due to his idealization of her, the moment of clarity instead robs you of any individuality you had in favor of her own acceptance. Although the princess is very obviously in the wrong here for what she does, I also have to admit I find her core struggles decently relatable. And the game's framing device of the moment of clarity struggles for companionship through her depiction as an average creepy doll face you'd find in a lot of slop horror movies is honestly really fucking genius. Overall though, what Slay the Princess shows with the moment of clarity is how important empathy is in a relationship, and how this often conflicts with intimacy. A relationship can very quickly become one-sided if one party lacks empathy, and we can see just how toxic and artificial a relationship can become when we attempt to unnaturally force a connection and intimacy with those we want to be close with. The final chapter that we shall cover in this video, and the chapter opposite to the moment of clarity, is The Princess and the Dragon. This chapter can be reached via the Spectre if you decide to let the Spectre possess your body as she requests, and then decide to slay yourself while she's in your body to betray and kill her. The Spectre attempts to release herself from your cage of flesh before you die. Her frantic exit from your body ends up bringing your spirit along with hers, although the other voices in your head remain within your original body. Seizing the opportunity to try and escape the cabin, the princess rushes to the exit. But before she can manage to escape, the princess is sent to the beginning, tied in chains again along with you, marking the beginning of this chapter. The Princess and the Dragon chapter plays out somewhat like a what-if scenario on if you could experience the story from the princess's perspective, as you are now stuck with the princess, waiting for the body you used to be in to return to the cabin. Once your body does return, you quickly realize that now that you're gone, the voices in your head which used to simply provide commentary are now the ones making all of the choices. While some, like the voice of the hero, don't want to slay you and the princess, the new voice that awakened this chapter, the voice of the opportunist, wants to slay the princess, and you alongside her since you're bound to the princess's body. The opportunist will eventually take the chance to plunge the blade into the princess's heart, which unexpectedly results in your spirit returning once again into its original body. From this point, a myriad of different events can occur, ranging from you and the princess becoming free from the cabin, to just abandoning her in the basement, or to slaying her again, leading to your souls and bodies becoming intertwined once more. Just like how we analyzed the moment of clarity before, I believe the Shifting Mound's description of this princess is quite insightful for the themes of this route, where she states that,
This one is perspectives bleeding into one. You know her better than you know yourself. She will make for an empathetic heart. Do not mourn her, for you would not mourn yourself.
empathy once again is a prominent theme that this route expresses, and this strongly reflects onto how our interactions with the princess go during this chapter. In The Princess and the Dragon, we can more directly communicate with the princess, and with that, she's able to learn a lot about our perspective of the situation. For instance, unlike how every other chapter begins with a title card informing you of the chapter name, when this chapter starts, it just directly cuts to its beginning. We can inform the princess of this, from which she ends up creating the chapter name herself, which is where the name of the route itself comes from. There's also additional things she discovers about us due to this new connection we have, like the reason why we tend to be so quiet is because of the voices in our head constantly arguing. This naturally makes The Princess and the Dragon the most meta chapter, as the elements of the game which were previously limited to our unique point of view as a player are things the princess is now predisposed to. And as for us players, we also get to better understand who the princess is, since we quite literally get to see the world from her perspective. The princess's nature as a creature of perception is most strongly hinted towards in this very chapter, as we can even observe how her physical form is indeterminate until our body decides to grab the pristine blade, and her form becomes more concrete. Additionally, The Princess and the Dragon is a route that carries over a lot from the Spectre. This is because the Spectre can either be nicer or meaner to you depending on how you treat her. The princess in the following chapter will reflect the personality of the Spectre you saw in Chapter 2, which can result in significant differences in how the route plays out. Once again, I believe this malleability of the princess reinforces the themes of this route, since her very nature is influenced by what you believe about her. These two variations in her personality also correspond with the princess in Chapter 1, who can either start as kind or as cold depending on if you took the pristine blade or not. which also furthers the theme of empathy in this chapter, since the princess and the dragon essentially lets you get a look at the princess from that first chapter. When comparing the moment of clarity and the princess and the dragon, there's a lot of minor moments that parallel each other, that while I'm not sure were deliberate, are definitely interesting to consider. For example, as I stated before in this section, the princess and the dragon notably lacks a proper title card for its chapter. This contrasts completely with the moment of clarity, because in that chapter you receive a countless amount of chapters and title cards. There's also the important detail of the princess's design, which are diametrically opposed with both of these chapters. While in The Princess and the Dragon, her design is nearly identical to the princess's design in Chapter 1, the design for the Moment of Clarity, especially in the Pristine Cut, is completely abstract nightmare fuel that fails to remotely resemble a princess. Additionally, there's also smaller moments which contrast well when paired together. Both chapters can share a moment where you and the princess hold each other's hands, and in both, the narrator will describe her hand as tender. In the Moment of Clarity, her hand being tender comes as a surprise due to how gleeful and terrifying she has been thus far. In The Princess and the Dragon, the only one to question the tenderness of the scene and her hand is the voice of the opportunist, who tried to kill the princess and you earlier in this chapter. In general, it's quite interesting how the roles of the antagonists for the chapter are reversed between the Moment of Clarity and the Princess and the Dragon. While in the Moment of Clarity, the princess naturally served as the antagonist, the Princess and the Dragon has you be the antagonist, or a part of you, anyways. The voice of the opportunist works wonderfully for the role of antagonist in The Princess and the Dragon too, as he completely counters the main theme of empathy the chapter emphasizes by being someone who only considers what he has to gain from his actions. His presence as the antagonist harkens back to shifting Mound's line of knowing the princess better than knowing yourself, especially since he's a vestige of the you who attempted to betray the princess again in the Spectre. Overall, I believe that these roots together explore the importance of empathy and intimacy in a relationship, both for our partners and for ourselves. The Moment of Clarity presents a relationship with one side desiring intimacy, but because the other side can hold no empathy due to the pain she's caused, she has to force a relationship between us herself. On the other hand, The Princess and the Dragon presents a relationship where one side is extremely understanding and empathetic, and where the enemy attempting to ruin your relationship has become the former part of us who only ever considered yourself and no one else. These roots together show how a lack of understanding of either ourselves or our partner can cause either person to hurt the other, and a relationship requires both of these things to remain in balance. As you've likely been able to gather from this lengthy video, Slay the Princess is a very complicated game. The most apparent aspect of the game, that is most commonly discussed, is the game's exploration of grand ideas like change and stagnation, and of life and death. These themes are superbly facilitated through the game's unconventional narrative structure of repeating loops to discover the many different iterations of the princess. Or similarly, when looking at this game, many people will examine and discuss the meta love story that the game presents, such as how this video has been doing. What I feel is often forgotten, however, is the game's very opening premise. The main objective of the game, which becomes immediately clear upon even just reading the title, is to slay the princess. Just the title and premise of the game alone hints at another facet of this game, which is that the game is clearly designed as a deconstruction and subversion of the archetypal save the damsel type of story. We begin in Chapter 1, called The Hero and the Princess. But instead of the hero saving the princess alongside the entire world, the princess is now the one who's an imminent threat to that world. This trope is followed through in some of the game's later chapters, which is the most apparent with the damsel in Chapter 2. The damsel presents herself as the most cliché and stereotypical depiction of a princess, a damsel in distress who must be saved by her dashing hero. But these tales often forego giving these princesses actual nuanced personalities, and they instead just become plot devices who serve solely as the heroic man's love interest as a prize for vanquishing unwavering evil. The damsel deconstructs and reflects this classic archetype, as she quite literally becomes more and more like a caricature the more you try to examine anything about her actual personality. We could even see this deconstructionist facet of the game reflected in a route we covered in this very video, The Princess and the Dragon. The name of this route itself is a reference to the classic tales of dragons capturing princesses that must be saved by noble heroes. Only this time, the princess considers you, who is supposed to be the hero, as the dragon. It's through the subversion of these tropes that the game can explore and depict what these relationships and the participants in them are actually like. As one of the endings for the princess and the dragon route describes, you are the victim and you are the victimizer. You are life and you are death. The hero and the princess and the dragon. Ultimately, it's this deconstruction that the game's narrative is founded upon. You will first encounter the princess, not knowing anything about her, or yourself for that matter, aside from the general tropes and roles you two are expected to fulfill as the hero and the princess. And with every interaction you have with the princess, your understanding of both yourself and the princess becomes more accurate and concrete. The roles you fulfill become more nuanced, growing more and more distinct from the tropes the two of you are meant to embody. Around 3 months ago, there was a podcast from the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences where an interview was conducted with Black Tabby Games, the developers of Slay the Princess, in which the developers said something about the game which strongly adds to what I'm saying.
Like, no matter what, you and the princess are tied together in this way. You are the two beings in this space, and you've been pitted against each other for some reason. So it just kind of naturally evolves from that, of just, that's the nature of it, and the relationship that you have with her and the way that it evolves changes her and it changes you. And it's very much based around kind of, in real life, you really only have like a minute to tell someone who you are before then it starts to be they've decided part of who you are, and like a few conversations is all it takes for them to kind of solidify a picture of you in their head, and then that is the version of you that exists inside of them.
As Katie and Catburger's analysis went over, the Chapter 2s of Slay the Princess presents different necessary components of a relationship, which begin to establish how the dynamics of a relationship focused solely on those aspects would play out. The Chapter 3s of Slay the Princess then exist to further develop these relationships, often portraying how we adapt when these flaws in a relationship exist for a prolonged period of time. Through this, we see the ugliest and most toxic sides to these relationships, but at the same time, we are also provided more options to mend them, as the underlying faults in them become more apparent to both partners. The Den and Thorn show us how relationships where one side engages only with natural instincts or eternal suspicion will inevitably lead to one side getting hurt and another lamenting what they've done. The Caged and Happily Ever After depict the extreme ways we could attempt to cope with stagnant relationships, either immersing ourselves in a false illusion of love, or by completely distancing ourselves from it to avoid being emotionally hurt and vulnerable. The Eye of the Needle and the Apotheosis present the importance of expectations in relationships. The two extremes of a relationship focused on this are either undermining our partner by expecting nothing from them, or preventing our partners from flourishing by holding them to strict standards. The Moment of Clarity in Princess and the Dragon explore the value of empathy in relationships, and how intimacy interacts with that. In a relationship where one side desires intimacy without empathy, we can attempt to mold the person of our desires into accepting us. And on the other hand, we can often fail to understand ourselves and begin to hurt our partners as a result. A good grasp of all of these elements is needed for a healthy relationship, and Slay the Princess's earnest exploration of all of these aspects of a relationship is what makes it truly special for me. Now then, that's all I have to say for this analysis of Slay the Princess. As I said at the beginning, this game is extremely near and dear to my heart, and it's a game I've wanted to give my thoughts on for a while now. At this point though, this game has already received very extensive and loving analysis towards it, so I hope to instead expand on some of the already existing discussion that has surrounded this game. If you enjoyed this analysis of Slay the Princess, then please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing, because it really helps boost my small channel in the YouTube algorithm. If you have your own thoughts on the chapter 3s I discussed, or if you would be interested in me covering some of the other chapter 3s that were excluded from this video and how they relate to love, then please let me know down in the comments section. But other than that, take care.